I think we're going to get started, everybody. Welcome. Can you hear me okay? Good. I'm Steve Cleese from the University of Maryland. I thank you all for coming on this International Women's Day. There was a bit of a celebration early this morning at 8 o'clock with the little armbands to remind us all that it's International Women's Day, and actually some singing of songs. This society is very supportive of gender for a long time issues and continues to be so. I'm joined on the panel by Joel Samoff of Stanford University and Nellie Stromquist of the University of Maryland. Salim Valley is not here. He chose to adhere to the international boycott that's going on of U.S. academic meetings due to the Trump Muslim ban. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that last week, Salim, many of you know, had a heart attack. But he's fine, he's home, and he's recovering, and our thoughts are with him. I'm going to start with a short introduction, and then each of us will talk in turn and then open it up for questions and answers. This panel fits very well with the conference theme of problematizing inequality. The Sustainable Development Goals are the major international response to global inequalities, and this panel is about problematizing the response in education. The International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity, better known as the Education Commission, recently engaged in an extraordinary process to produce an unusual report called The Learning Generation: Investing in Education for a Changing World. The Education Commission report is the product of a year-long intensive effort, 172 pages in length, over 400 footnotes, supported by over 60 background papers. The commission was convened by the Director General of UNESCO and the heads of state of Chile, Indonesia, Malawi, and Norway, and supported by the UN Secretary General, headed up by Gordon Brown, former UK Prime Minister. The Commission's members are current and former heads of state and government, 5 Nobel laureates, government ministers, and prominent people in the fields of education, business, health, and security. Initially funded for a one-year effort, a second year of funding was secured, and the commissioners have agreed to stay on and advocate for the report. The Commission promotes major global changes in almost all aspects of education. Although the initial mandate of the report was financing education, the Commission quickly concluded that they could not make finance recommendations without substantial reforms in other areas. They pay attention in the report to 4 areas: the performance of education systems, needed innovations, efforts towards greater inclusion, and finance. Our panel, given time limitations, will focus on our critique of the report, but we all agree that there is much to commend in the report, among which its strong advocacy for global support for educational investment, its comprehensive attention to educational issues, its strong research base involving hundreds of researchers around the world, and the substantial efforts it took in running widespread consultations prior to the report, managing all these researchers, and getting 27 very prominent commissioners to agree on a report, all within the space of the year. And finally, the report's good intentions in trying to make EFA and the SDGs a reality. However, the 4 of us believe the report has some very fundamental failings. To our knowledge, these are not being sufficiently discussed. Efforts seem to be directed towards implementation of the report's recommendations, rather than to a fundamental dialogue over the directions needed. This report is extremely important. For like EFA and the SDGs themselves, it is about the future of education and development around the world for decades to come. In our view, there are no neutral or objective or technical answers to the education and social problems our society is facing. So it's not surprising that we find the report controversial. In this panel, we offer some of our views. We haven't coordinated our talks, so I'm sure there will be some overlap in our comments. With that, let me turn it over to Joel Samoff of Stanford University.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the introduction. I want to welcome Baila Jamil, who is one of the commissioners of the report. So we not only have the report to talk about, but we have a commissioner who's joined us for the session this morning. And as I say that, she knows that I will always ask hard questions and say challenging things about the report. My task this morning is to prime the exchange that we hope we will have over the course of the next, over this session. As you saw, you heard from Steve, and as you saw in the description of the session, the learning generation is both one more in a long sequence and a new step. The long sequence, at the very least, goes back to Jomtien in 1990 and carries through Dakar in 2000, and then Incheon, and then through the Millennium Development Goals up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a chain that, since the goals haven't been achieved, might be called a chain of aspiration. I think it's mostly really a chain of exhortation. Exhortation over what is now 27 years about education for all that's still not achieved. The Education Finance Commission is unique in its focus specifically on finance, and in its effort to take its focus on finance beyond finance to talk about the content of education and about the links between access and quality and all of that. The commission is unique in its composition, as you heard, and so it's reasonable to begin with very high expectations for this report. The titling of the report, Learning, is itself a bit of progress. The learning was always at the center of the thinking of the people who participated in the earlier conferences, but for the most part, the attention was schooling, not learning. And it's really much more recently that in the latest of the global monitoring reports, there is a shifting of attention to learning, or at least the rhetoric is moving toward learning. In the World Bank's 2020 strategy, there's attention to learning. The Sustainable Development Goals talk about learning. And so there's progress here. And yet, when you read the report, it is almost entirely about schooling. And it has a very narrow specification of learning, and I'll come back to that. But for those of you who haven't seen it, you really should look at the graphic, one of the graphics in the Global Monitoring Report just before the SDG conference, in which it projects the time needed for poor girls in poor countries to achieve full primary education. For those of you who haven't seen it, that date is 2086. And for poor girls in poor countries to achieve secondary education, which is now part of the expected goal, the projected date is 2111. That is, the projection is if the world keeps doing what it's doing now, it will take 100 years to get to the goal. And we know when the world said it would take 10 years, it didn't work. And when it said another 15 years, it still didn't get there. We've now got another 15, but the projection is way out. There's also progress here on finance, the things that are needed to achieve education for all. The figures are indeed dramatic. There's recognition of unfulfilled commitments. And there is, I think, progress in the notion that since education is primarily a national responsibility, the primary funding has to be national funding. And that is somewhat new in these reports on finance to education. What I don't regard as innovative in the report is the effort to link finance with outcomes. That is, for those of you who've been at other sessions in this conference, a very heavy focus, that notion of results-based financing. And what that does is it stands outside the black box of education and loses the attention to education as process. And for educators, that's really frustrating, since much of what matters about education is the process rather than the outcome. There's also progress here in the firm insistence that education is a right, and there's an extended discussion in the report on education as a right. The problem there is that it's not clear that the commissioners really believe what they're saying. Right before they talk about education as a right, they say the case for investment in education is irrefutable. That is, they're making an instrumental argument about why spend money on education. And immediately after saying that education is a fundamental right, we find education benefits the economy and individual incomes. Education, especially for girls, is the vaccine for healthy populations. Education increases peace and stability. Education is essential for sustainable development. I certainly understand why people want to make the practical argument for investing in education, spending money on education. But if education is a right, then all that is really distracting. If education is a right, it doesn't matter whether or not women have healthier children. They are entitled to education because they are citizens of the world, not because they have healthier children or there's some other benefit that we can find. Why does that matter? Well, I've heard a minister of education in Africa argue that people in his country who have AIDS or who are even seropositive should not be admitted to teacher education because that would be a misuse of public resources. Public resources are invested in teacher education in the expectation that the new teachers will then have a lifetime of service in the education system to the country. And how can that be if we know that their lives are likely to be shorter because of their health? I've also heard the argument that the allocation of resources in education is necessarily a matter of public choice, and therefore it is reasonable to spend, not to spend additional resources to provide education opportunities for learners who have difficulty seeing or who have difficulty hearing or who have some other impediment that makes learning, creating learning opportunities more expensive. If education is a right, none of those should arise. It's not an issue of wise allocation of public resources. It's a provision of education to everyone who arrives at an education, who needs access to education and should have access to education. There's a whole series of issues I want to raise, and so I want to move on to do that. What's problematic here, and I want to cast my comments, the balance of my comments, in terms of what I see as failures of analysis in the report. That is, important issues that really require heavy-duty attention where the report doesn't do that. And it seems to me without that analysis, we have no way of making ground on why it is that Education for All, which was promised in 1990 and again in 2000 and again in 2015 has not been achieved and won't be achieved for a long time. Why is it that in poor countries, my own research is largely in Africa, the tax collection system doesn't do better in generating resources for education? Why is it that foreign aid to education has plateaued and has declined? Why is it that the share of foreign aid allocated to education has declined? That is, within aid to education, the share allocated to education has declined. A whole series of issues that need to be addressed that don't get addressed. So as I said, I want to use my time, the time that I've left, to talk about what seem to me to be important failures of analysis in the report. And I want to do that. You'll all be surprised if I try to be a bit provocative, but bear with me. I want to do that by making some pretty bold statements about what I think is the case, then explain why I think there's a failure of analysis and what the consequences of that are. First, formal education systems I refer mostly to Africa in my work. Formal education systems cannot meet the education needs of African children and adults who cannot effectively read and write. Notwithstanding the attention to learning, the Finance Commission report is almost entirely about schooling, and about schooling that begins now at the preschool age. What's the failure here? Well, the failure is to recognize this enormous population of school-age children who are not in school, and of adults who've never had access to school. In many African countries, it's still a third or more of the primary school-age children who are not in school and who will not have school education opportunities. And even with the most heroic efforts and the greatest increase in funding, schools cannot solve that problem. The failure of analysis, then, is the failure to address the learning needs of what could be even the majority of the of learners who haven't had access to good learning opportunities. And where might that analysis have led? Well, it might have led toward a systematic attention to how one might address those learning needs, and how one might finance those learning needs, and how one might address the political as well as the economic obstacles or the financial obstacles to providing those learning needs. And the failure also means that in the calculation of how much money is needed, there is no significant attention to the money that would be needed to provide education to learners who are not in schools and who are not likely to be in schools. Second failure of analysis. Efforts to bypass teachers cannot possibly improve education, and most likely won't work. And here, it's a very striking failure because the Finance Commission report does better than many other documents in highlighting the importance of teachers in the learning process. It notes that improving education requires helping teachers develop their professional competence. It calls for professionalizing the teacher corps. That's outstanding. Many reports dismiss teachers and see teachers as obstacles, not as the central actors in improving education. But then the Finance Commission totally ignores the current situation. I speak again of the African context that I know best, in which there is extraordinary pressure to hire as teachers people who have barely completed secondary school, certainly have no pre-professional education, and are getting hardly any, if any at all, in-service teacher education. And the failure then is the failure to pay attention to what is now a significant part of the teaching corps in contemporary Africa. And I'm leaving for the moment on the side teachers in what is now an expanding pool of private secondary schools who are also most often not very well prepared and don't have significant access to in-service teacher education. What we see here is, after this very strong commitment to teacher education, almost a recourse to what was, I think, back to the failure of TV education in West Africa that goes back to the 70s. The notion of gathering a few skilled teachers in one place, let them do some curriculum, and send it by TV to a bunch of people somewhere else. And the people in the somewhere else are the ones who turn the TV on and turn the TV off and administer the exercises that those who are the skilled people have done. We know that doesn't work. It's been tried in different forms in different places, and it won't work now or in the future. Where might a better analysis have led? Well, it might have led to paying some attention to the roles and experiences of the underprepared teachers. We do have them. I have 11 items on my list, and I'm up to number 2. We do have the teachers. Those teachers are in the system, and the analysis might have paid some attention to how to improve their competence and their skills and their ability and enable them to become better teachers. It might have paid attention to a career path for those teachers so that those teachers can become, in time, with access to services, fully supported teachers in the system. And it might have led to some very productive thinking about what gets very little attention in the education part of the story, and that is peer-assisted learning. Where there are classes of 80 or 100 children, there's not likely to be enough new teachers very soon. What else then might be done? How might that be financed? And so on. Okay, I'm going to jump from some other comments about the education system to the aid system. And here's the failure. Education in Africa has become significantly aid dependent. You all know that. It's become worse in Africa. It used to be that the funding from foreign aid agencies was a small percentage of total spending. There are now 11 countries, by my count, in which foreign aid is paying the teachers. That is, foreign aid is a significant portion of recurrent funding, and that is effectively not addressed in this extraordinary report on education finance. And the consequence of that, why is that problematic? The consequence is that for Africa, there is planned dependence. Into the foreseeable future, there will be dependence of that sort and all of the problems that are characteristic of that. Where might the analysis have led? Well, it might have led to a more critical exploration of that dependence, and it might have led in 2 productive directions: organizing aid in ways that decrease rather than increase that dependence, And where it is the case that the foreign aid is paying the teachers, it might have led to some productive thinking about a weaning strategy. That is, about how to get from here to there, how to get to some point that the Finance Commission says is important, national funding of education, where there's not now national funding of education, how to get from here to there in some more manageable strategy. Let me talk for a minute or add one more comment about the conferences. In this era of international conferences and global goals, it's not clear that the conferences themselves have been major gains, but what is clear is that the international financial institutions have taken over the roles of the former colonial powers and then of UN institutions in managing the integration of countries, poor countries in the world, especially in Africa, into the global political economy, largely on terms set outside Africa. Here, the failure of analysis is to pay attention to what role the conferences themselves play, what role the managers of the aid system play, and why that becomes an obstacle to achieving the specified goal, that is education for all. The concern of the Finance Commission is about education finance. What they don't look at, the Commission itself didn't look at critically, the mechanisms of education finance. It didn't look critically at how the finance is transferred. It didn't look critically at the Fast Track Initiative in the earlier era, and particularly in the current era, the Global Partnership for Education. So it's not self-reflective and self-critical. Moving quickly. Got it. I want to end up with, as I said, I had 11 and I won't get there, but I'd be happy to say some more when we have a chance to continue the exchange. A major focus of the Finance Commission is foreign aid and the role of foreign aid. And I want to end with a provocative challenge, and that is that it seems to me that foreign aid can address the education needs of the poor learners in poor countries only when it's reconceptualized as a strategy for redistribution. The affluent countries of the world all employ a redistributive mechanism for funding education. Those who pay more taxes pay more of the cost of the education system. Those who pay no taxes because they're poor don't pay directly for the education system in that form, but in principle, everybody gets to send their kids to school. It doesn't work perfectly, but the principle is clear, that the burden of paying for education is shifted toward those with higher incomes, both individuals and companies, and that the redistribution is the access for those who aren't paying those. Thank you, Steve. Bells are ringing. The failure here is to step back and recognize that a bit more funding and a bit better funding from foreign aid and a bit of push to get the countries to do a bit more financing cannot achieve the goal of education for all. Back up a step. If education for all is a global responsibility, then this set of recommendations cannot achieve the goal of making the parallel commitment that says funding education for all is a global responsibility. I began my comments with a notion of about a chain of exhortation from at least 1990 to the present. It seems to me that my conclusion is pretty simple. Notwithstanding some useful steps forward, the conceptual and analytic failures of the learning generation make it yet another episode in this chain, which really, on reflection, we should be calling not a chain of aspiration, or not even a chain of exhortation, but as a chain of control. And we need to deal with it as a chain of control, and without that, even the 100-year target for education for all will remain beyond reach. Thank you.
Next up is Nellie Stromquist from the University of Maryland.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to be able to express some comments about this report. Knowing the background upon which it was presented, it seems to be a major undertaking to criticize such a report. But I share what Joel has said, that despite the tremendous participation and the tremendous deployment of energy, there are some issues that one can take to task. What I'm saying on the first slide is highlighting the fact that although education is always credited with many, many virtues, it remains an unsupported field, right? And of course, there are many theoretical questions to ask about it. The discussion of the report has to be made in the context of global policies, the existence of global policies, because the report is aiming to produce some answer to global policies. So let us revisit for a moment what are the objectives of global policies, right? They attempt to bring attention to core societal problems. So in that sense, brings to the fore aspects that might have not been discussed with the same salience in the past. They also try to identify, there's a little dislocation here between the screen and the microphone. They try to identify common goals and targets, right? And therefore, what is something very positive about global policies is that they attempt to shape the future, right? There was one participation I had before that had as a subtitle, The Unknown Future, and I said the future is shaped by us. And I think that global policies are an attempt to shape the future, and that certainly is very positive. Then one third goal, not to be underestimated, is to mobilize both human and financial resources to attain such goals. So, let us revisit a little bit the funding practices in education, because again, understanding the past helps to understand the present. As you know, education is always identified as a key concern for development. The greater GRP, the greater democracy, the more participation in the labor force, better health conditions, even empowerment of women, right? So that discourse is always present. But in practice, we know very well that some low-income governments cannot invest to the full extent that they would like to. And at the same time, when it comes to actual distribution of resources, we have plenty of evidence that shows that international development agencies in the final analysis have low commitment to education, right? What is the evidence for that? There were EFA goals, and then the educational goals within the MDGs, and we know that they were short, and this computation of being below targets is, financial targets is very confusing. I find different estimates, and when we're talking of billions, 1 billion is a big difference. Anyway, some of those shortcomings in terms of budget for the MDGs and EFA, MDGs education and EFA, are supposed to have been between 22 billion and 26 billion per year short, right? And this includes both domestic and international support. When we come to the SDGs, right? Here the World Bank is introducing a new discourse, a new phrase, and is saying, with the SDGs, we're moving from billions to trillions, right? So that the scale has enormously increased. And what are then the estimates? One is, well, several estimates. I have found that they're saying it will be needed from 4.5 trillion to 8 trillion per year, and this is a computation that includes state spending, investment, and foreign aid. For education alone, SDG 4, we're talking about a gap that will have to be found someplace that will run from 37 billion to 39 billion per year. So, what are some corollaries that follow from this state of affairs in the financial condition? Governments don't have either the funds necessary to support education to the extent that is needed, and perhaps not even the will, right? And this is the conceptual and political analysis that Joel so well underlined. It's a problematic issue. We need to understand very well what happens there. A second corollary is that additional funding is crucial. There's no way out if we want to accomplish some of the SDG funds. we need additional funding. The third point is that those fundings, that funding will have to be found and gathered from multiple sources, right? Many players, many institutions come into the picture. And then the final one that makes logical sense, but as I will explain, also has at the same time presents some flaws. The idea is that the resources would multiply, right? If we find a coordinating body that can put them together and therefore be able to be more effective in gathering those funds. So here comes the report, The Learning Generation, Investing in Education for a Changing World. Nice title. What would that report do? I mean, what does the report propose, right? It would create a financing compact mechanism, right? Remember this as I move forward. This mechanism, right, would assign a major role to multilateral development banks. So we have now a very well-defined, very well-positioned set of actors, namely the MDBs, right? And we will see what possible consequences this is going to have. MDBs, right, being banks, don't gather money, right, from poor individuals. Banks gather most of their money from people who take loans and who want to make investments. If this is the case, many private investors are going to enter the picture. The efforts then of the MDBs would be to have efficiency and effectiveness in education. Good goals. I don't think there's anything really problematic with these goals. And also the report presents very high promises, right? This time, the MDBs, with coordination, will be able to gather the funds that before were not possible. So there are promises that they will be able to gather $20 billion per year, and they would also take upon themselves to raise funds from other non-state actors, namely philanthropies, corporations, and charitable organizations. You know this picture, right? That's the World Bank. We can end poverty together. Okay, so what's wrong with this picture? And I don't mean the World Bank, but the picture of the monitoring, the Learning Generation report. The report very clearly identifies 4 needed transformations for education. These transformations are given as totally previously discussed, and therefore with a legitimacy to become the sole criteria for distributing potential funds. The decision-making body behind the assignment of funds would be, and only be, the MDBs, right? With some coordination with UNESCO and UNICEF. It is unclear to what extent there will be flexibility and to what extent the recipient country's input would be considered, right? That is not discussed in great detail. So what I would like to do is to unpack the 4 transformations of the report: performance, innovation, inclusion, and finance. Performance, right? We all want to perform better than in the past. Certainly, it's a noble human desire. The report calls for systematic national learning assessments, right? That a country wants to have national learning assessment, of course, is to be appreciated, right? How well is the nation performing as an entire system? But since the international community should track, rank, publicize countries' progress, we go back to the list of countries, and you know that you can only produce a list of countries if you are dealing with standardized testing, right? You cannot have one based on qualitative data or separately nationally developed testing. You have to have a global testing to have global rankings. So what I wanted then to mention is that learning is further reduced to reading and math. And a number of us working on questions of social justice, including gender issues, are convinced I have come to the conclusion, right? So it's not just a personal conviction, that you cannot reduce learning to reading and math, that you must include essential life skills, all the way from citizenship to understanding values, to understanding how we can have national cohesion, all these desirable goals to have a better social order. And then, as Joel has mentioned, the performance when you read, and you don't have to read between the lines, you can read on the lines. Learning is linked from teachers, right? They are only mentioned in association with teacher absenteeism, right? And there's no reference to improving their salaries and working conditions. This is a perennial problem that public teachers have all over the world and continues to be a silence, a disregard, right? A neglect. What about the other one, innovation, right? The report identifies 3 measures to be taken. The first one, and again, Joel already referred to that, is that it proposes the introduction of more teacher aides in the classroom, right? To support the teacher. But is to support the poor teacher who has had little training, right? This is one of the conditions that de facto is going to emerge. Then it proposes to have much greater use of digital technologies in classrooms and schools, and increased partnership with non-state actors, especially the corporate citizens. Right now, large entrepreneurs have become citizens of the world, corporate citizens, right? Something that one could debate here, right? What is a citizen? Who should be a citizen? And these corporate citizens are to play an important role in the expansion of private and innovative financing for education. I would say that the most innovative aspect of the report is the innovative financing, right? But, right, I would argue that having teacher aides does not resolve the problem of quality, that in some cases it might be the equivalent of having, instead of 1, 2 untrained persons in the classroom. There is no categorical evidence of the positive impact of digital technologies in classrooms. And if you have non-state actors involved in the funding of education, right, most of them would enter driven by a profit rationale. So in the States, where you have lots of digital technologies in the classroom, teachers are asking, right, let's stop talking about teaching with technology and let's start talking about teaching, right? So even there is skepticism. What about the question of inclusion, right? It endorses progressive universalism, fine, prioritize the poor and the disadvantaged and move gradually. It's okay. I mean, I can see that there could be a strategy that says 1 step at a time. It recognizes the importance of addressing problems of education of girls in Africa, but again, it's this very reduced way of looking at what gender equity would mean. And one observation that I have said, and I have mentioned many times, is that there is a continuous disregard for theory. Therefore, there's an attempt to deal with deep causes of inequality. We come to the core of the paper, which is the one on finance. And the core objective of the paper, the strongest objective of the paper, is really the creation of a new funding architecture. The MDBs would become key mechanisms to raise the funds. They would also coordinate and harmonize lending investments. And the funding for countries would be based on those key measures that the report has outlined. Namely, we're talking back of the 4 transformations that they so envisage. What are they? Standardized testing, digital technologies, increased teacher aides, and promote some form of attention to girls' education. So what is missing from the report? Again, I said no attempt to deal with theories of social change and the role of education in it. And these theories of social change, as already Joel has mentioned, would have to include discussion of the actors that sustain the inequalities, right? It was not just how we get to a better world, but what is supporting the world that we don't like, right? What is the power structure that is behind that? No, the report is too polite to talk about things like that. Again, there's no reference to adult education. And I think this is very much related to a theory of social change. You want to change society, my goodness, pay attention to parents, pay attention to families, and that means the role of education cannot be, in a proper way, neglected. And then, why do we have to get funds only from private entrepreneurs through loans, right? Why don't we consider other possibilities presented by Nobel Prize winners in economics, such as the need for a global taxation, right? No, this is not really discussed. And then there is a very limited attention to what are key actors in the learning process? Teachers, right? You cannot change the educational system if you don't talk about teachers. Money counts, no question about that. So, let me finish by saying, what do I see as positive implications and negative implications of the report? Positive implications, more funding would be available. I don't know if they will be able to reach the 37 to the 39 billion, but more money will be available. Hopefully there will be a reduction of efforts, of duplication, and maybe this time, unless the previous occasions where there was not money, maybe this time, right, we will have the funds required for attaining the goals. Now, negative implications? Funding will be limited to areas considered critical by the report. De facto policies then is going to be enacted by the MDBs, right? And I would say, as never before, nations now are facing a unified bloc that supports funding. Before they could do the rounds of international agencies, no, this time there's going to be one single bloc that will coordinate and harmonize. There's increased role of private entrepreneurs, and we can discuss the implications of that. And then there is this growing contradiction between education as a common good and as a service for sale. These are implications that really merit much greater discussion. So, in sum, right, I think, and many of us think, that the negative consequences of the report's recommendation are greater in number than the positive features of the report, and that there will be a dominance by the North in defining South problems, and that this time, this domination would be institutionalized through this funding mechanism. So, one question that I have here is, are we back to the future in terms of colonial relations? Thank you.
In my presentation, I wish to briefly discuss what I consider 4 fundamental problems with the report. My first problem, and perhaps most astonishing when I read the report, is that the report gives up on achieving many of the education SDG promises before we have even tried to fulfill them. The goal of 2030 is unceremoniously moved to 2040. And even in 2040, if the world follows all the Education Commission recommendations for education, even in 2040, only 80% of students will complete secondary education. So much for the SDG promise of universal secondary education by 2030. And in terms of learning, the picture is even more dismal. While we'll get universal primary education by 2030, not all children will be learning as promised in the report, as promised in the SDGs. These projections depend on an array of assumptions. But the assumptions are not facts. I believe at this early stage, it was incumbent on the Commission to focus on what it would take to achieve all the SDG targets. The SDG targets were approved unanimously by the United Nations. I think it was a major error for the education SDG targets to be somewhat abandoned or postponed already. Secondly, many of the report's recommendations are directed towards improving the performance of education systems. I found many of those recommendations problematic. First, as Nellie said, there was an overemphasis on international and national testing, a very narrow slice of cognitive skills, and this is going to be a boon to testing companies, but will likely shift attention away from other important educational outcomes, as happened with the testing regime of No Child Left Behind in the United States. Second, the report purports to show the relative cost effectiveness of 20 what are called best proven practices to improve learning, such as computer-assisted instruction, ability grouping, performance incentives, and community-based monitoring. To me, this is giving bad advice using bad data. We do not agree on the costs or effects of any of these reforms, certainly not at a global level, but also not at national or even local levels. Best practice is hotly debated, and there are no blueprints. Moreover, many of these 20 practices are essential rights, not options, and should not be implemented based on their cost effectiveness, such as mother tongue instruction, providing schools with water and washrooms, malaria control, or even school feeding. All of those are necessary, not something to be optional. A glaring omission to this list of interventions is class size, and it is seen as reasonable to have large class sizes. Even by 2030, 40 as a pupil-teacher ratio is taken as a target, and it's an average ratio, which means that many classes, even in 2030, will be way over 40. How many researchers, analysts, and policymakers would want to send their own children to a first grade classroom with a class size over 40? Another troubling recommendation that Nellie talked about was getting all schools online by 2030, believing that technology can improve learning and lower costs. I believe internet access is a great tool, but it's a costly add-on, and it's not proven to improve learning even in the cognitive sense. The only way it reduces costs is by further increasing the class size, which is just unacceptable. Joel talked about a basic problem with the unremitting focus on results and result-based financing throughout other recommendations, not just the Commission. And again, results are defined narrowly in terms of a few attention to cognitive outcomes and not attention to good inputs. Good schools require well-educated teachers, good curriculum, adequate supply of good materials, etc. In the rush to focus on learning, attention to critical inputs is being ignored, not just by the Commission. Finally, regarding educational performance, there are some major gaps in the issues the Commission pays attention to. Both previous speakers mentioned it doesn't talk about adult education at all, and higher education is not treated well either. Turning to finance. Finance was the central issue of the Commission, and the lack of finance has probably been the most significant obstacle to achieving EFA and the MDGs in past decades. By 2030, the Commission projects that we're going to need a 6-fold increase in international assistance. Where this $90 billion is going to come from each year by 2030 in the Commission's report is unrealistic and perhaps even dangerous. I think it unrealistic to expect philanthropists, corporations, and charitable organizations to contribute $20 billion a year by 2030, and whatever they do contribute will continue to be uncoordinated, self-interested, and misdirected as it is now. As Nellie elaborated, the Commission relies heavily on this new coordinated multilateral development banks combining the World Bank and the regional development banks. I doubt that the money is going to be forthcoming. It's a six-fold increase in bank financing. But more than that, as Joel, Nellie, I, and other colleagues have pointed out, that the World Bank and the regional development banks have been ideological institutions, not at all evidence-based as they claim, committed for over 30 years to a particular set of neoliberal education reforms. This World Bank on steroids financing proposal turns over education reform to the vagaries of bank ideology. The Commission ignores two solutions to the lack of finance. First, for some reason, they decide to let wealthy nations off the hook. Instead of the 0.7% of GDP that has been agreed upon since 1970, the target, even by 2030, is only 0.5% in the Commission's report. If the international community were to live up to its stated commitment, we would not have to renege on SDG targets. Second, as Nellie mentioned, the report basically ignored one of its own background papers that I helped organize, which argued that all 17 of the SDGs could be fully financed if we developed global tax mechanisms to tax corporations fairly, to tax wealthy individuals, and to tax financial transactions. Lastly, I want to talk briefly about the broader societal context for the SDGs. In the Commission report and elsewhere, education often seems like a miracle cure for the ills of the world. While I am a firm believer in the value of education, it's far from a panacea. The report spends no time examining why EFA and the MDGs have failed, nor why over the longer term, 50 years of promises by the international community of universal primary education and broader development goals have borne such little fruit. In my view, as I and many others have elaborated elsewhere, the problem is structural. It's in our world system of neoliberal capitalism, underpinned by patriarchal, racist, and other structures. This world system is not conducive to achieving education or development goals. In my view, despite good intentions and the efforts of many of you and us and many others, the EFA and the MDGs and the SDGs have not been sufficiently serious efforts. Relatively few resources have been devoted to them, and none of these efforts challenge the dysfunctional structures in which they are embedded. Unfortunately, the SDGs continue to serve in large part to legitimate an extremely unequal world in which literally billions of people are relegated to a marginalized existence, legitimating this world by promising that we are slowly addressing the problems. We need to transform neoliberal capitalism if we wish to address education and the other SDGs. Among other things, neoliberalism has exalted the private sector and treated the private sector as a key partner in education and development efforts. Business leaders had a major role in the Education Commission, and the role of the non-state sector is emphasized in the report. Neoliberalism has spent the past 40 years pushing the privatization of education, and we badly need to move in the opposite direction. In a past life, I went to Stanford Business School. There I had a professor who wrote a paper entitled "The Social Responsibility of Business and Other Pollutants of the Air." He was pro-business. His point was that the business of business is business, and we shouldn't want or expect them to solve problems that are fundamentally government's. Whether the transformation of neoliberal capitalism means a return to a more liberal welfare state, or a more radical change based on more participatory approaches to governance and more democratic approaches to the workplace, remains to be seen. However, without such a change in social context, the SDGs will remain more dream than reality. To conclude, Gordon Brown, in his preface to the Commission's report, states, "We cannot accept another year or decade like this." But the report does, and we do. The report talks of the lives that can be saved if we meet the SDGs by 2030. What about all the lives that will be lost if we wait until 2030 or 2040 to achieve the education and other SDGs? Right now, we live with global triage, saving some lives while letting so many others die or barely survive due to situations we can remedy. Right now, international aid is basically charity, dependent on the self-interested whims of the wealthy. This must change. Sharing this planet's wealth more equitably and treating the Earth with the respect required for our own survival are essential. My fear is that without major societal changes, we will get to 2030 with neither the education SDG nor the other SDGs fulfilled. My hope is that around the world, this is more widely recognized than ever before, and that there are more advocates than ever before for the type of transformations that we need to live equitably, well, and peacefully on our severely threatened planet. We need to use the Commission report and the SDGs themselves as an impetus for broader participatory discussion of needed education and social changes. Thank you. Before opening this up to your questions and comments, I have a question for you. So, how many of you, by a show of hands, think that there is a good chance we will get to 2030 once again without even achieving universal primary education? Just put your hands up and look around and see the degree to which we're very much in fear of this consequence happening. Thank you. We'll take questions. We'll take questions and comments from the audience. And please keep your comments and questions brief, and we'll come back to the panel at the end. If I could get 2 volunteers to help me pass around the mics. Anybody volunteer? Please, let me start with you, as an Education Commissioner.
I just wanted to first ask your permission whether I can actually respond. Is that fine? Or should I ask questions because I wanted to respond? If that is permissible, then I'd like to move. Okay, I will try. Thank you very much, and I think people like myself who come from the civil society and represent alternate voices in the Commission, I think it's always very important to listen to this kind of panel to see what is being thought from other sides, and I say other sides. I mean, I think what has been suggested here has been well thought through, very polemical, I must say, and I wonder, in fact, if this has been read word for word, and I will just say a few things. One of the things that came out as a surprise, because through all those very intensive months of the first year of the Commission, people who were represented, you know, other than ministers, prime ministers, presidents, etc., also people from civil society, including Education International representatives from teacher associations, the discourse which went on the crafting of the Commission's report was a very deep one, and also something that not all of us always agreed on, and it took a lot to be able to reach there. And I wonder if that has been missed altogether by the panel. I think the whole commission's premise is the number of out-of-school children. It starts with that crisis, then talks about the crisis of skills and so on and so forth. And I think that needs to be put in context rather than saying that the out-of-school children have been just dismissed and schooling is the answer. The second aspect, where again through a caricature, the suggestion is that it is technologies that's going to be substitute. Out of the 8 things in terms of the first pillar of what is a high-performance system and what works, out of the 8 interventions, technology comes at number 6. The first one is basic education. The second one progressively goes on, and I've got that out, on mother tongue and bilingual teaching. Third was on remedial and so on, and teacher support and so on. So I'm surprised as to how this is being pulled out of context. And I think it's important. I don't know how many people have read the Commissioner's report. I've got some of the CDs there. I think it's important to see. I will move quickly on to the issue of how the Commission, as being suggested, is actually thinking of dumping or bunking the 2030 agenda. In fact, if we look at the Global Education Monitoring Report, where I'm again represented, that it suggests that if you look at, and the Commission constantly disaggregates countries by their income level. So from low-income countries to low-middle-income countries to upper income countries to, in high-income countries, it's hugely disaggregated because it needs very different treatments. And therefore, the notion of progressive universalism as a concept is very important when we look at all, but you look at those which are likely to be most excluded. And hence, the whole transformation pillar of inclusion is so important because it's not looking at just the most excluded, it's looking at emergencies and looking at early childhood and looking at working across sectors. And I think that, my God, I'm just wondering where that discussion all went. So the Global Education Monitoring Report says that if you have 84% children today in in secondary education, completing secondary, you have only 14% completing in the low-income countries and 34% in the low-middle income countries, which means there is a huge road to travel. And if you've not seen the Global Education Monitoring Report, I would ask you to really look at it because it has given you the trajectories that if you go with business as usual, this is where it's going to be. I think that needs to be looked at in context because it's not just 27 people who are all working, by the way, completely on a voluntary basis because this is public service. And this is a real, so the work of the Commission is not exclusive to itself. The Global Education Monitoring Report, which is got the main responsibility on reporting on the SDGs, SDG 4 in particular, in relation to the others, is doing its homework pretty hard, and the crunching is there. I would really urge people to look at that hard crunching data, and the 60 studies were not just in vain. They were there because that's why the 400 footnotes are there. It's not just because it has just been put to make lives difficult for people who want to read what's gone behind every sentence of that. I come to the financing, and I'll stop at that. On the financing side, the most important piece is looking at the disaggregation of the countries which need urgent attention. The big story and the big news is that you have to be able, those countries need to become serious about education. And if those countries in low-income countries, low-middle-income countries are not serious as the first target countries, well, then domestic financing will continue with business as usual. And in the domestic financing, and I don't know how many of you heard me at the UN General Assembly representing the case, the first one was, will the tax to GDP ratio improve in these countries or not? Because you cannot have a country like Pakistan at 9% and still expect that you will reach those targets. So the first story or the first conversation has to begin with those countries themselves. The countries must make a commitment to higher domestic financing, and in fact what is being suggested is 90% to 95% coming from domestic financing, better domestic financing and tax justice, and then looking at the options which are being suggested from international finance. And where the international finance improvement has to also triple the support to the Global Partnership for Education, so they're not being excluded. And I think I wonder, and I'm really surprised, because I suppose these conferences are great fun because they are provocative, they generate debates, but I would really request that the debates need to be informed and not select things, you know, in a biased manner. Please present it the way it comes through. The story of the 4 pillars and the 12 recommendations of the 4 transformations are very well articulated by no less than all the Nobel Prize winners over there, by no less than people like myself and people from Education International and people who are active on these, or no less than people like Kailash Satyarthi, who's talking about children who are excluded or in extreme forms of child labor, people who are in gender equality, and so on. It just almost seems as though we were there just notionally. We spent a lot of time, and we continue to spend a lot of time. It's still work in progress. So we are out there giving our time, being there, and I'm a bit disappointed, to say the least, in the way this has been problematized in this amazing conference on problematizing inequality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations and specifically the call for self-reflection and self-critique. My question is for Dr. Samoff. Your addressing of the critical failure of analysis around teachers, teacher training or teacher education, and peer learning. So the recommendation, the 4th recommendation for the learning report talks about strengthening and diversifying the teacher workforce. They say on page 71 to professionalize teaching and non-teaching roles to enhance skills and statuses. And there's one quote that I wanted to get your thoughts on in terms of how to move forward. It says, traditional teaching in classrooms are being flipped, with the teacher or professor largely guided and facilitating self-learning and peer learning, and with facilities often giving space for team learning. They give examples of Escuela Nueva and CAMFED. And so I'm wondering, in this specific recommendation, what do you think is missing, and how do we ensure that it's moving towards the structural changes that Dr. Cleese had pointed to? Thank you.
No? Okay. Thank you. So my name is Maria Rombalcera, and I'm from the Right to Education Project, and we were commissioned a paper as well. And thank you very much, especially to Bela, because she was raising some of the points that I was going to raise. And this is about the need for domestic resource mobilization, which is over 90% of what this is needed. Although it is in the report, it's not in the advocacy. And what we are hearing about is this emphasis on the MDBs. And this is what is being pushed, and it's taking too much of the space. And also what we are seeing as well is this emphasis on the private providers. So this is a problem, and it has been a problem both in the report and what's happening at the moment. And when we were talking about education as a right, it's about the state as the duty bearer. So I see a cognitive dissonance there in terms of this need that seems to me quite ideological for the private sector as being the silver bullet solution to all the problems that we were seeing before. And I would take the business as usual. That's not going to work, especially because of the business side of it. I think that if we take education as a commodity, these out-of-school children are not going to be there. The equity lens is not going to be there because we know how the market works. So we need to take, again, education as a right. We need to take, again, the state as being the duty bearer, the responsible. We need to take, again, public education, which is the one that is serving the most marginalized groups. Even if they are out of school, they are their best chance, and not this low-fee private school. And we need to take, again, the right to free education, not affordable education, which is being the new discourse. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I like to, first of all, to congratulate the panel, but say only one thing, that what you are saying really put the burden and the challenge in building a very robust programmatic Education 2030 agenda. What we need is to really talk about education, talk about the content and the purpose of education. That's what is the vote in this debate. So I believe that the most important challenge we are facing is how we give effectively programmatic backup, programmatic content to the new educational agenda, that it is apparently transformational, progressive, but it hasn't until now provided the tools and the ideas to effectively implement it. So what you have is this alternative agenda that is quite contrary to many of the aspects that we are talking about, but also we don't have elaborated further what means a transformative agenda. So I don't put the challenge in the other ones, I put in the challenge in those of us who really advocate for a progressive agenda. Because, and I finish by this, I come from the Latin American region, I'm working on UNESCO, but I come from Latin America, and I tell you, in the last 20 years, there has been a lot of progressive governments in Latin America. But the gap between the rhetorical progressive education and the reality is very huge. Why? Because in Latin America, as in another region, we haven't elaborated deeper into what implies a transformative curriculum, pedagogical, institutional agenda in education. So this gap between the rhetoric and the reality, we have to work and we have to strengthen the institutional backup, the institutional programmatic agenda of this new for 2030. If not, we are going to keep doing business as usual, and we are going to have more of a defensive discourse than the proactive discourse with a real impact. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for highlighting this important topic. My name is Iris and I'm from Bar Ilan, Israel. I'm kind of wondering, I think we're in a stage where you were trying to argue for global tax, and I'm not sure that we are there, and I'm not sure that the other innovative mechanism of finance that the other report was trying to argue for is something that not need to be discussed also. So I'm not sure whether there is a voice for the global tax that everyone agree upon, or we should go into the direction of innovative finance. Thanks.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Hello? Is it working?
No, no.
Oh, it's okay. It's on, okay. I will address specifically the one point, one of the pillars dealing with innovation, which has evoked so much emotionally. I wasn't privy to all these international meetings and discussions and deliberations. My point of departure is the document, right? And as I look at the document, meaning the report, I use the tools of the social sciences, namely content analysis, right? To be sure, there was a table with these 8 points. But when you read the text, and I spend lots of time on the text, so it's not just, an improvised analysis. The report made 3 specific recommendations under the rubric of innovation, right? The diversified teaching force by having more teacher aides. Second, it was the increased use of digital technologies. I came to the conclusion that one of the priorities in the use of technologies is the recommendation for the use of digital technologies in terms of the amount given to the discussion of that term, the text that is expressed, the detail in which it goes. So for me, that was a key reference. Rather than looking at the listing on the box, on one box, it was the amount of the text. And then I also put together if you are going to create a financing development mechanism, obviously that mechanism is linked to who are going to be the most likely persons to come for this kind of innovation. I wonder how many are going to come to support the use of both domestic and international, to support the use of native languages in the classroom, right? So there's definitely a connection between saying we are going to have this banking mechanism, which is going to attract many actors, many non-state actors, and the expanded use of technologies, because this is not only expanded in the text, but it's also a point that has a clear linkage with what follows later in terms of the support for loans.
Is it still on? I want to take up three, I think, of the questions that were asked, and I think they make the point, they help me make the point that I was trying to make about analytic failure. You raised the question about teachers and teaching and the recommendations that seem pretty positive. The fourth recommendation is strengthen and diversify the education workforce, and then there's a whole series of what I regard as absolutely outstanding thinking about what should be going on in teaching. Professionalize the teacher corps, provide materials, lots of other good stuff. And so in that respect, as I said at the outset, there is in this report some very productive thinking about the role of teachers, the importance of teachers, the centrality of teachers, and about ways in which the teachers, preparation of teachers can be innovative. Now, my concern in my comments was what I was calling analytic failures. The failure here is that's not what's happening in African schools. What's happening in African schools is recruiting pretty much straight from secondary school teachers who have no pre-professional preparation, not much opportunity for in-service professional teaching, in instruction in very large classes. And so all of these things that are listed that sound like great ideas in the report miss the pressures that African education systems must react to by those who provide the funding, who are telling them that it is cost ineffective to allocate resources to professional teacher education. It is cost ineffective to do what in affluent countries everybody thinks is really important, that is, enable teachers to develop their professional competence. So my point was not that the report doesn't talk about these things. I think the report says very positive things about these things. But I think there's an analytic failure here that's the missing piece of it is to look at what is happening in schools and why. And the why comes out of aid-supported education and aid-dependent education in Africa. The two are linked. So there's a second analytic failure, and that is to miss the link between what is problematic in schools on the ground and the aid system. So yes, lots of good ideas, but at the same time, one more quick comment on that. The emphasis is, or there is an emphasis here on fostering innovation, and at the same time, there's a pretty heavy-handed discussion of best practices. And it seems to me those two are fundamentally at odds with each other. Either the notion is that teachers should be involved in developing curriculum and materials, which the report says, or there is the notion that what is happening on the ground should be continued. That is, that those who run schools should look at what's being done somewhere else and figure out how to turn that into what can be done in the school system that's being aided. I know I'm not persuading you, Bella, but I'm talking about what I see as fundamentally missing pieces in this story. I missed the last one. Oh, the global tax question that Iris raised at the end. Perhaps you're right that it's premature to be talking about a global education tax. I don't think so, because I think if we're raising the issue of education for all as a global responsibility, we must have the discussion, the parallel discussion, about financing education for all as a global responsibility. And so if we're not ready tomorrow or the day after for a redistributive mechanism, whatever it is, whether it's a tax or something else, we need to be talking about it now, and we need to be thinking about not only what we think is desirable or we ought to be having, but how to get there. So even if the future is some years out, we need to be talking now about how to get there, and what that means is talking about how to get there within countries as well as at the global level. What's not persuasive to me is the alternative is financing mechanisms that depend on bonds. A whole lot of the financing that's discussed here has to do with one sort of bond scheme or another, organized around these development banks, or what may be plural, or maybe a few, or maybe one large development banks. Think about using bonds for funding education. If you are running a factory, it makes sense to borrow money in the expectation that you will use the money in a way that increases your revenue stream, so you'll have something to pay the money back with when the time comes. But in general, only in very indirect ways do schools generate a revenue stream. So to use bonds to finance primary education is to say to the 7-year-olds, yes, please come into the school, and then you have to pay the money back when you get older. That's what a bond is in the context of poor countries. It is borrowing money with a very long time span to pay back, so that those who are now the 7-year-olds and the 8-year-olds and the 9-year-olds in the school eventually will become responsible for the bonds. Those who live in the U.S. know that story. We borrow money to build schools. But how do we pay the money back? Schools don't generate revenue. How do we pay the money back? We pay it back out of the general tax structure. So at some point in the future, those who pay taxes have to pay the money back for the bonds that were used to build the schools. The point is that bonds are a borrowing mechanism. And I do not see borrowing mechanisms as a very productive strategy, however complex they can be, as a very productive strategy for financing education. And the bigger risk, it seems to me, at this point, we know what securitization is in the world. We know what it did to housing in the U.S. We know what it did to Silicon Valley in the U.S. And there is contemporary talk about securitizing bonds for education. That is, layering bonds on top of each other and using those bonds to borrow more money, and then using those bonds as collateral to borrow more money. And I think that's a big risk for education in the world. A quick comment, Viola, friend Viola. I think it's our role to raise the hard questions, so that doesn't surprise you. What I think is important for me in thinking about all of this is to think about how it is that the structures we create and that in which we assign responsibility to people who are well-meaning, good-thinking, good-hearted, future-oriented people, nonetheless, those structures end up holding us back. And to me, that's the serious analytic challenge. It's not bad people who are doing bad things, that's easy to understand. It's when it is our colleagues participate in a process that, in my view, ultimately ends in or leads toward entrenching dependence and therefore entrenching poverty. That's the analytic challenge that, as analysts of education, we need to pursue.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I mean, the SDGs represent an unprecedented commitment of the international community, much more so than the MDGs in many ways. You saw the pessimism around this room of our ability to even meet minimal goals. We need to do something unprecedented to achieve those goals. It's not just not business as usual. We have to rethink our structures. We have to rethink our financial architecture. We need to rethink the World Bank and the IMF. We need a fund for development that is less technocratic and more democratic. I urge people to read the report. The report was very rich. It had a lot in it, a lot of effort went into it. All of this is well-intentioned. My critique and Nellie's critique appear in the Comparative Ed Review, and Nellie's in this last issue as a book review, mine in the forthcoming issue. I believe there will be a response from the Commission. What we need is a lot more dialogue and debate. And it is fora like these that are necessary around the world to talk about how do we progress from here. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the Commissioner's impassioned response. Have a very good International Women's Day.